What are some of the impacts of inflation? And so you might have noticed if you've been to a store recently or you've bought anything that the cost of goods has gone up over the past year. And that was confirmed by the recent release from the BLS. Their new consumer price index shows a 5% increase in the consumer price index over the past year. And so today what I really want to do is talk about what does that mean. Let's zoom into a breakdown of that by goods and see what that looks like for consumers. Let's also expand that to businesses and producers and say, what does that look like from a business's perspective as a way to forecast this in the future? And then again, what is the impact of this on the workforce ecosystem and what is this doing to talent? And so starting with that breakdown in terms of how is this inflation broken down by good types? The first thing you'll see that's really going to jump out is the increase in energy cost. Again, we've seen over a 20% increase in energy costs over the past year. And the place that that's particularly pronounced is if you've been to the gas station recently, those costs have increased 40% over this past year. And now part of that is driven by the historical lows that we had last year in the pandemic with a lot of stay-at-home orders and people not traveling. There was excess supply that really brought those prices to recent historical lows. And so part of this is a correction as people are getting back out, returning to pre-pandemic level pricing. But again, we are still seeing inflation play out in this energy sector. And some other areas that are seeing higher levels of inflation over the past year, you're looking at new and used vehicles. Again, with the chip shortage, with a lot of supply chain issues that we'll talk about later, that's really driven up the cost of vehicles recently. And then again, if you've been to the grocery store anytime in the past year, you've likely noticed this as well, the 10% increase in meats, poultry, and eggs. And again, thinking about the pandemic, early on in the pandemic, a lot of this we were seeing increased levels of people buying groceries where we really hadn't seen people buying groceries at that level since the mid 90s. And so you're talking about it, that was a reversal of almost a 30-year trend there. And so part of that is the demand that has increased over the pandemic. And then again, part of this is going to come back to these producer supply chain issues that we'll talk about a little bit later. And so that's really what I want to talk about now is, again, what has been the impact of inflation on businesses, particularly with respect to that producer price index, as that's kind of a leading indicator for the consumer price index. And what you'll notice if you look at the producer price index over that same time period, September of 2020 to September of this year, you've seen a 9% increase in the cost of production of that producer price index. And so again, I want to highlight this because, like we said, this is often used as a leading indicator for that consumer price index. So we're likely to continue to see this play out over the next few months where we're continuing to see consumer prices rise. And now to really get into those supply chain issues, again, what's driving this? Well, a part of it is that increase in the cost of finished goods. That's the biggest increase in the producer price index. And a lot of that is, again, driven by these supply chain disruptions that we've heard a lot about. The pandemic-induced shortages where things are on back order. We have a lot of reorganization going on in the economy that's causing these supply chain disruptions. And so what I have on the screen for you is a recent survey of small businesses where about 40% of U.S. small businesses experienced domestic supply chain disruptions recently, but that was almost 50% in North Carolina. So again, the impact of these supply chain disruptions has been particularly pronounced here locally, where a lot of our local businesses have felt that even more than the national average. And that's, again, a key driver for what we're seeing in this producer price index that is ultimately being passed on to consumers in the consumer price index. And so last thing I want to talk about is, again, what does this mean for the workforce? So given the rising prices and the rising cost of goods, what does this mean for workers? And the first thing I want to note is that because of that, we've actually seen a decrease in real wages over the past year. While wages have risen since the start of the pandemic, with respect to inflation over the past year, we've actually seen a very slight decrease because of the rapid pace of inflation. And so I really wanted to start there because while we had seen wages rise really between January of last year and September of last year. And wages have continued to rise in terms of the actual value. This inflation has really started to outpace wage growth. And as a reminder, in the last video where we talked about over 4 million Americans quitting their jobs in August. So again, potentially another factor here where individuals are getting paid less because of inflation, even if they're making the same amount of money. And so that pent up frustration leading a lot of individuals to seek new and better opportunities to perhaps earn more money to offset some of this rising inflation. And so again, just to end us here, the last thing I want to talk about is, what does this mean for you if you're a business that's struggling with this? So again, if you have a business need that involves people, we can provide no cost assistance. And that really breaks down into these two areas: talent acquisition and talent retention. So again, if you're struggling to hire right now, if you're one of those businesses that is feeling the impacts of increasing cost and feeling the impacts of having to pay higher wages, but a shrinking labor pool, again, we can provide financial assistance for you to hire new full-time permanent employees. We can provide temporary staffing. And if you're just struggling to retain talent right now, again, we talked about this in our last video, some of those findings from the Charlotte Talent Survey, where we can help you make sure that individuals are on a pathway to career advancement with our occupational skills training. And we can provide financial assistance for you to upskill employees so that they can enter new and better roles within your organization. And again, if you're interested in any of these services, please feel to reach out to us at any of the contact points listed on the screen. But that's all I have for you today, and I hope you enjoyed this quick update on the impacts of inflation.